The Forgotten History of Slavery Around the World Europe. Italy, Venice and Genoa, the raven who followed the ships. I have flown over many cities, but there are two I remember especially well: Venice and Genoa. Humans remember them as cities of merchants, ships, palaces, churches, gold, spices, silk, bankers, explorers, beautiful things, and they were all of those things. But ravens see what humans sometimes leave outside the paintings. I saw the people who were bought and sold there. My family came from the east, far beyond Italy, beyond Greece, beyond Constantinople, across the Black Sea. That was where one of my ancestors first learned that humans could put a price on another human being. He lived near Caffa in Crimea. Today you call the city Feodosia. In his time, Caffa was one of the great Genoese trading colonies of the Black Sea. Its harbor could be crowded with ships. Merchants came looking for grain, wax, furs, fish, spices, silk, and people, especially people. Do not imagine that everyone being sold there looked alike. They did not. Some were Tatars, some were Circassians, some came from the Caucasus, some were Slavs, some were Greeks. Others came from communities whose names would mean very little to most people today. And many were young. Women and girls were especially sought after for domestic service. Men and boys could also be sold. Some people had been captured in warfare. Others had been seized during raids. Some had been sold because of poverty or desperation. Sometimes human beings were sold by people from their own communities. Sometimes children were sold. The documents still exist. That is important, because this is not a legend ravens invented. Humans wrote it down. My ancestor watched them arrive, sometimes individually, sometimes in groups, confused, exhausted, terrified. Perhaps one person had been captured only days before. Another might already have traveled hundreds of miles. Imagine being taken from a village in the Caucasus. Your mother is gone. Your father is gone. Your brothers and sisters are gone. You do not know whether they are alive. You are marched toward a port whose language you do not understand. Then someone examines you. Your age matters. Your health matters. Your appearance matters. Your strength matters. Because those things affect your price. Your grief does not. There is no column in the merchant's account book for grief. A buyer looked at the girl. He examined her. Questions were asked. A price was discussed. A notary recorded the transaction. Ink touched parchment. Money changed hands. And the girl belonged to someone else. Humans are very fond of documents. Sometimes they use documents to prove that a person owns a house, or a field, or a ship. Here, they used documents to record ownership of a human being. Not far away was another important trading center, Tana. Venetian merchants operated there. So did Genoese merchants. The two republics were bitter commercial rivals. Venice and Genoa fought wars against one another. They competed for trade routes, ports, colonies, profits. But their commercial worlds overlapped, and enslaved people moved through both. A person captured somewhere near the Black Sea might enter a Genoese network. Another might enter a Venetian one. Sometimes the routes crossed. Sometimes merchants from the rival cities operated in the same regions. Sometimes enslaved people from similar places ultimately appeared in households hundreds or thousands of miles away. The merchants competed. The captives suffered regardless of which flag flew above the ship. Ravens do not care much about flags. We care about food, trees, roofs, wind. But humans care enormously about flags. The banner of St. Mark meant Venice. The cross of St. George meant Genoa. My ancestors learned both, because they followed both kinds of ships. Let us follow one. A Genoese vessel leaves Caffa. Among its cargo are enslaved people. They descend below deck. The Mediterranean slave trade did not always transport people under exactly the same conditions. Some voyages were shorter, some longer. Some captives traveled in small numbers aboard vessels carrying many other goods. Others moved in larger groups, but none of that changes the central reality. They were being transported because someone claimed ownership of them. They could not simply tell the captain, "I have changed my mind." They could not purchase passage home. They could not walk away at the next port. They were cargo that could speak, cargo that could cry, cargo that remembered home. The ship reaches the Mediterranean. Perhaps Constantinople appears in the distance. Perhaps it travels through the Aegean. Perhaps it stops at an island. Perhaps the captive is sold before ever reaching Italy. Because Genoese and Venetian merchants did not merely carry enslaved people to their own cities. They participated in a much larger Mediterranean commercial system. Christian lands bought enslaved people. Muslim lands bought enslaved people. Italian merchants traded with both. Egypt was an especially important destination for enslaved people coming from the Black Sea and Caucasus. So were other parts of the Eastern Mediterranean. The trade crossed religious boundaries, even when laws sometimes tried to prevent particular kinds of sales. Greed had a remarkable ability to find a route around laws and principles, but some captives reached Italy, so my family followed them. First, Genoa. If you approached medieval Genoa from the sea, the city seemed to rise directly from the mountains. Buildings crowded against the harbor, ships arrived from across the Mediterranean, dockworkers shouted, sailors hauled ropes, merchants argued, notaries wrote. Church bells rang. And somewhere among the barrels, ropes, crates, animals, sailors, merchants, and passengers were enslaved human beings. Do not picture one enormous square with thousands of people standing upon platforms. That is too simple. Genoa itself was the marketplace. Sales could be arranged through merchants, brokers, households, notaries, contracts. Human beings entered the same sophisticated commercial world that handled ships, property, credit, insurance, and merchandise. That is what made the system so disturbing. It did not always look chaotic. Sometimes it looked orderly, professional, legal, respectable. The notary dipped his pen. He wrote the seller's name. He wrote the buyer's name. He recorded the person being sold, perhaps an age, perhaps an origin, perhaps a price. Then the document was witnessed. A human life had become a commercial transaction. The buyer went home. The seller collected the money. The notary moved on to the next piece of business. And the enslaved person lived with what had just happened. What happened afterward depended on the buyer. Some enslaved women became household servants. They cooked, cleaned, carried water, washed clothing, cared for children. Some worked in workshops. Some were sent elsewhere. Some eventually gained freedom. Others did not. Some women were forced to serve as wet nurses. Think about what that could mean. A woman might be required to nurse another family's child, perhaps while separated from her own. A document might call that labor. A mother might call it something else. And there was another danger, sexual exploitation. We should not hide it behind polite language. Enslaved women had limited power to refuse the men who owned them. Some were sexually abused. Some became pregnant. Some gave birth to children whose lives were then shaped by the complicated laws and customs surrounding slavery, legitimacy, inheritance, and freedom. The records do not tell us every assault. Of course they do not. The people committing abuse were not likely to record every crime against the people they controlled. But slavery creates power, and enormous power creates opportunities for terrible abuse. Then my ancestors flew east across northern Italy, over mountains, fields, rivers, until the water appeared again. Venice. There is nowhere quite like it. A city built upon islands, boats instead of carts, canals instead of streets, palaces rising from water, the bells of churches echoing across the lagoon. Foreign languages everywhere. German, Greek, Arabic, Slavic languages, Italian dialects, Venetian. A merchant could stand near the Rialto and hear half the Mediterranean speaking around him, and among those people were enslaved men and women. Venice had participated in slave trading for centuries. Its geographical position helped connect Central Europe, the Adriatic, the Balkans, the Eastern Mediterranean, and the Black Sea. The people appearing in Venetian records changed over time. Slavs, Tatars, Circassians, Greeks, people described as Muslims, Africans, and others. Venice's empire stretched through islands and ports across the Eastern Mediterranean. Crete, Cyprus, other possessions and trading stations. Enslaved people could therefore move through an entire Venetian maritime network rather than simply into the city itself. One of my ancestors lived on a Venetian rooftop. He liked fish. Venice was an excellent place for a raven who liked fish. One morning he watched a woman step from a boat. She had crossed a world she had never intended to cross. Perhaps she came from the Black Sea. Perhaps the Caucasus. We cannot know her exact story. But stories like hers happened. A merchant led her through the city. She passed buildings more magnificent than anything she had ever seen. Marble, columns, churches, palaces. She may have passed wealthy women wearing fine cloth and jewelry. She may have smelled spices from places even farther from home than she was. Venice could display the extraordinary achievements of human civilization, and at the same time, a human being could be bought there. Both things were true. That is something ravens understand better than humans sometimes do. Beautiful places can contain ugly things. A magnificent building does not make everyone inside it good. A prosperous city does not mean everyone living there is free. And civilization does not automatically eliminate cruelty. Sometimes civilization organizes cruelty very efficiently. Venice and Genoa were alike in important ways. Both were maritime republics. Both built enormous commercial networks. Both operated in the Black Sea and Mediterranean worlds. Both used written contracts and professional merchants. Both bought and sold people from many regions. Both sent enslaved people into households and other forms of labor. Both could connect a captive taken hundreds of miles away with a buyer who had never seen the captive's homeland. But they were not identical. Their empires were different. Their colonies were different. Their political systems were different. Their commercial routes differed. Genoa's position in Caffa made it especially powerful in Black Sea commerce. Venice had its own strong presence at Tana and throughout its eastern Mediterranean empire. They competed fiercely, and the balance between them changed over time. The people being sold changed too. In some periods, Tatars appear prominently in Italian records. Later, more Circassians and other Caucasian peoples appear. Political events changed supply routes. Wars changed them. Conquests changed them. The rise of the Ottoman Empire changed them dramatically. When Constantinople fell in 1453, the political geography of the region shifted. And something else was happening. Look west, beyond Genoa, beyond Spain, beyond Portugal, beyond the Strait of Gibraltar, the Atlantic Ocean. Now watch Genoa carefully. Not because Genoa alone created what came next. It did not. And not because the medieval Black Sea trade and the later Atlantic African slave trade were the same system. They were not. The routes were different. The scale would become different. The political structures were different. The populations targeted were different. The plantation economies that developed across the Atlantic created demands of a different magnitude. But some of the commercial skills and financial networks that Genoese merchants had developed could operate in new places. Credit, contracts, insurance, investment partnerships, international merchant connections. Ships required money before they sailed. Cargo had to be financed. Risk had to be divided. Investors expected profit. Genoese merchants understood these things extremely well. And as Europe's commerce moved increasingly into the Atlantic, some Genoese money moved with it. In the 1520s, Genoese capital helped finance commerce connecting São Tomé, off the coast of Africa, with the Spanish Caribbean. Enslaved Africans were part of that commerce. Later, Genoese merchants and financiers would also participate in the commercial world surrounding Spanish contracts for supplying enslaved Africans to the Americas. The word often used for those monopoly contracts was asiento. Remember that word. We will return to it in another story, because the Atlantic slave trade did not operate only because captains owned ships. Someone financed those ships, someone extended credit, someone insured voyages, someone invested money, someone expected a return. And sometimes the people providing that money never saw the African coast. They might never see the inside of a slave ship. They might never hear a captive scream. They could sit at a desk and profit from what happened thousands of miles away. But that story belongs partly to another time. For now, my family remained in Italy, watching. One raven lived above a Genoese notary's office. Imagine him there. The window is open. A merchant enters, then another. Contracts are discussed, numbers are calculated. A young enslaved woman waits nearby. Nobody asks what she wants. That is the detail humans forget. They discuss everything except the one question that matters most to her. Where do you want to go? Nobody asks, because slavery begins by deciding that the answer does not matter. Perhaps she remembers mountains. Perhaps she remembers snow. Perhaps she remembers a village beside the Black Sea. Perhaps her mother is still alive. Perhaps every morning her mother wakes wondering where her daughter is. Perhaps she never learns. History is filled with mothers who never learned what happened to their children. Fathers too. Brothers, sisters, husbands, wives, children. When historians count enslaved people, we count individuals. 1, 2, 10, 100, 1,000. But every number once had relationships attached to it. That is what numbers hide. My ancestor watched the woman leave with her buyer. The merchant folded the contract. The notary cleaned his pen. Business continued. Ships arrived. Ships departed. Money changed hands. Church bells rang. People ate dinner. Children played. The city went to sleep. That may be the most frightening thing about slavery. Life continues around it. People become accustomed to things that should horrify them. A man may walk past another human being sold and complain about the price of bread. A woman may hear that someone's child has been taken away and hurry home because supper is getting cold. Cruelty does not always announce itself with trumpets. Sometimes it becomes routine. Ravens notice routines. We know which fisherman throws scraps, which baker leaves a window open, which roof becomes warm in the afternoon. And my ancestors learned another routine. Ships arrived, captives arrived, documents were written, money changed hands. People disappeared into households, then another ship arrived. Venice changed, Genoa changed, the Black Sea changed, the Mediterranean changed, the Atlantic world rose. Eventually, the old medieval slave routes declined or were transformed. But the human ability to turn captivity into commerce did not disappear. It found new routes. New investors, new ports, new victims. I am a raven. Humans sometimes think ravens are symbols of death. Perhaps that is unfair. We do not create your wars. We do not write your laws. We do not build your slave markets. We simply arrive afterward, and we watch. My ancestors watched ships leave the Black Sea. They watched captives arrive in Italian ports. They watched merchants calculate prices. They watched notaries write contracts. They watched servants disappear behind the doors of wealthy houses. My family remembers one last thing. A raven once sat above the harbor at Genoa. Below him, merchants were unloading a ship. Behind him stood the city. Ahead of him stretched the Mediterranean. Farther west, the Atlantic. He spread his wings. He could fly wherever he wished, across the harbor, across the city, across borders no raven had ever agreed to recognize. Below him stood a young woman who could not. He flew. She remained. And perhaps that is why ravens remembered her, because freedom is easiest to overlook. And generations later, other ravens would watch European ships turn south toward Africa. Different people, different routes, different systems. Another terrible story. If you ever visit Venice, look at the water. If you visit Genoa, look at the harbor. Imagine the ships, not just the famous explorers, not just the merchants, not just the spices and silk. Remember the people whose names disappeared. The girl from the Caucasus, the Tatar boy, the Circassian woman, the Slavic captive, the African who arrived in Renaissance Italy, the mother nursing someone else's child because she was a slave, the servant who slept behind a kitchen, the person whose entire existence survives today because a notary wrote down a price. They were there, they were human, and their lives mattered before a merchant ever placed a value upon them. When you have never had to ask another person for permission to possess it. This was the story of Venice and Genoa, and the people their magnificent cities bought and sold. Thank you for watching. If you learned something from this story, please like, share, and subscribe. There are many more stories to come about slavery around the world, as well as the history of North America and the United States. But there is a larger reason for telling these stories. The history of slavery should not become a competition over whose ancestors suffered most or whose people were the greatest victims. Slavery has touched peoples and civilizations throughout human history. The names, places, laws, and circumstances have changed, but the terrible idea that one human being can control, exploit, buy, sell, or profit from another has survived. George Santayana famously warned, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." And slavery is not only part of our past. According to the International Labour Organization, a United Nations specialized agency, there are more people in slavery today than at any other time in history. Nearly 50 million people are estimated to be living in modern slavery. So perhaps the most important question is not whose ancestors suffered the most. Perhaps it is, what can we learn from what happened to them, and what can we do for people who are suffering today? Learn to recognize forced labor, human trafficking, forced marriage, debt bondage, sexual exploitation, and other forms of modern slavery. Become informed, pay attention, support responsible efforts to fight exploitation. And when you encounter someone being treated as though his or her freedom does not matter, do not simply look away. We cannot change what happened centuries ago, but we can decide what our generation does about slavery today. That may be one of the most important reasons to remember history.
Learn to recognize forced labor, human trafficking, forced marriage, debt bondage, sexual exploitation, and other forms of modern slavery. Become informed. Pay attention. And if you believe someone may be a victim of trafficking, forced labor, or another form of exploitation, do not simply look away. But please remember, helping does not mean putting yourself in danger. Do not confront a suspected trafficker or exploiter yourself. Do not attempt a rescue on your own. Instead, tell a trusted adult or report what you know to the appropriate authorities or a legitimate anti-trafficking organization. If someone appears to be in immediate danger, contact emergency services. Sometimes doing the right thing means recognizing that something is wrong and making sure the information reaches people who are trained and authorized to help. For students interested in a more in-depth look, there are reflection questions as well as questions for further research at the end of most chapters.